Hi, this is Generous Theology. What are you reading in the new year? Chuck and Brock review reading they've done from the past year, and contemplate possibilities for new reading.
Certainly, a lot of why I read is just that. It's designed to share. And honestly, it's interesting. It's been now 15, not quite 20 years, but at least 15 years, where I joined our denomination Leadership Development Network. They have in each region, they had these networks, and they were originally designed around training church plant to grow the church. And I wasn't necessarily interested in church plant. That wasn't where I felt my gifts were, and I still don't necessarily feel that it would be where my gifts are. But I was really looking for the opportunity to engage more deeply, to do something more than just the typical Bible study at church, where I could go a little more deep with people who are, willing to go a little more deep. And this was that opportunity. And so I do get the opportunity to go out and preach on occasion. And so there is a sense in which a lot of my reading is reading for preaching. It's reading so that I have background, not necessarily just regurgitating the material I'm reading, but so that I have a lot of background, so that when I do preach, I have background knowledge on things, and so the work I do in preparing a sermon has something behind it. And so that's certainly part of the reason that I do it. I also find that even just the opportunity to engage with people, whether it's the people in my book clubs where we all purposely read together for the purpose of engaging with the world in whatever kind of book club that is, whether it's my church fiction book club or whether it's the group of guys that I meet with on every other Wednesday morning, or whether it's the pastors that I read with, or what the reading that you and I do together. A lot of that is designed to be shared and is designed to hopefully have an impact, have an influence on the world. I often think of how, obviously we're not Muslim, but the Muslims have this system of madrasa where they bring people in to study the word with the idea that they are now going to be a scholar and they're going to be able to take that with them. And I think Christians ought to do more of that. And obviously it's for some, not all, not even most, but there are some madrasas that are there for very negative purposes. But we ought to have ways for Christians, whether it's at the secondary school or at the college and university level, or a little more informally for adults. We ought to have places where people can study together and then use that in the world, even beyond what we do in church. As to your concern that the culture is changing, and certainly the culture is changing, there's no doubt about that. We are exactly the diagnosis. I think reasonable people can disagree on where it's changing and where it may be going, but there's no doubt there's change. No doubt that we as Christians are going to have to deal with that change, and we're going to have to engage the world. And the only way that we're going to have any ability to engage the world is, first of all, to have knowledge. If we try to go out there and make a case for our way of thinking, and yet we have no knowledge of our own ways of thinking, we're going to be pretty easily contradicted, and people will be able to point out where we even misrepresented our own ideas. But we also have to be winsome, and you talk about that a lot, that it's really important for Christians to engage in a way that is strong, that stands firm for those things that we believe are first principles, and that includes things like the reality of God, the fact that God is creator of all and is sovereign over everything, and that Scripture, the Word of God, is authoritative, and that the Spirit works through people. So we got to stand up for that kind of stuff, but we also do have to engage in a way that we can stay involved in those discussions and not just be written off. And that requires being winsome. It requires having an understanding of other points of view. It requires a give and take where it's appropriate, recognition. And that's why our earlier discussion, I think, on common grace was so good, because there is this real sense that if we really believe in the truth of common grace, if we really do truly believe that God spreads his gifts among believer and unbeliever alike, then we have to expect that there are going to be unbelievers who have insight that are worth thinking about and are worth engaging, and sometimes even worth recognizing as having truth to them. It may be truth that is by mistake, as a way of putting it, because they don't recognize that the truth that they are reflecting is the truth of God, but it is truth nonetheless. And if we recognize that, I think that enables us to be more willing to engage and more willing to accept even those who oppose our ways of thinking as human beings created in the image of God, who have knowledge and learning and information that's worth engaging with. So I think it is important to do that in any era, whether it's the changes we're seeing now or whether it was in other eras of history where there were different things, that were being dealt with.
I didn't specifically answer your question as to what I'm working towards in 2022. So let me do that. I brought up the existential issue, which is this even the right path to go down, given that this new thing is emerging, this new thing is hatching, a new culture is being born right before our eyes. But let me get back into the weeds here to answer your question. I have 5 or 6 Oxford handbooks to go through, including Plato, Aquinas, the Oxford Handbook of Systematic Theology, which would be a very interesting thing for me as a Reformed person to go through and compare and contrast. I would say outside of Reformed theology, which I consider to be the crown jewels of Christianity, I would say the kind of orthodoxy that comes out of the Oxford Handbook of the Systematic Theology, for example, to be one of the most mature competitive voices, let's say, in the Christian marketplace. I have the Oxford Handbook of the Early Christian Studies, Biblical Studies, and Christology. So there are topics there that are very important to me. I mentioned also working with metaphysics, a volume on medieval metaphysics from Pasnow. And I hope to be able to talk with you and other listeners here more about that when that volume comes in. It's a very exciting volume for me to have because I'm always looking to cover large swaths of history in the best ways possible. And I just get a sense that Pasnow is going to really bring those goods in that particular volume. I also have 3 volumes of biblical interpretation from a liberal scholar, James Barr. And there I wish to go in and interact with his material, maybe in a critical fashion, find out just what it meant to be a classic liberal theologian in the 20th century. I think James Barr fits that. He's got a good corpus of work, and I have those volumes, so I'll be ready to work through those. I also want to continue on with Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics and Voss's Reformed Dogmatics. Those are just wonderful material. It's just like your home cooking, so to speak. If you like to eat barbecue like I do, it's like eating at my favorite barbecue joint to have Voss and Bavinck. Also, I have Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, 10 volumes to go through, as well as 5 or 6 systematic theologies. Chuck, it's very quickly getting big here. I've talked about a lot more that I'm sure I will get to in 2022. There's one other major area that I'd like to do, and to work more with Augustine. His confessions have proved a challenge to me in the sense of I'm not a puzzle person, Chuck, but I've talked with puzzle people. And for puzzle people, there is a really special joy with a good puzzle. Fitting the pieces together, putting it together. Augustine is still largely a puzzle to me, even though so much of what he says is so important. I don't feel that I know him. For example, I would say I know Isaac Asimov. I've got a critical reader volume for Augustine's Confessions. I'm not sure if I might not get into some of his other works, but I think Augustine is the great linchpin that holds Orthodox Christianity together. If you're apart from Augustine on some of the major issues, and I'm thinking here of anthropology, understanding of grace, then I think you're really lost. I think you're off the main trunk of Christianity. And that's my thesis, my working suspicion. I'd like to read Augustine and see that proved, but it's not there yet. So there may be some surprises in store, Chuck. And even though I'm shocked at the birth of a new culture happening right in front of my eyes, and I wish to engage with it, I also, in some sense, don't wish to engage with it in certain ways. And what I mean by that is this. The Bible speaks of don't cast your pearls before swine. And it's not my intention to just demagogue people who think differently from me. But there really is a strong sense in the culture now, in these culture wars of weaponization of ideologies. And this idea that if you don't hold to the right orthodoxy, you must be canceled, you must be hunted down, cancel culture must dox you, get you fired, that sort of thing. And I don't really want to be a part of that. I don't see anything edifying for the kingdom happening in that sphere. And I'm very dismayed that we're going in that direction, but I'm also dismayed that though I am, it also is what it is. It could be a defining moment in this new cultural rebirth. And so I want to engage critically, but I also want to engage generously. Not just because I don't want to be canceled. Of course I don't want to be, but not just because of that, but because I don't think I don't think it's going to make a difference if I just come out with my cutting, cancelized version of why the new culture that's being born right now, it is the worst thing since sliced bread. There's a danger. Once you start down the paths of polemics, it's very difficult to not become defined by that. And so I know a lot of good Christian ministries with brothers who I sort of respect and admire. But maybe 2 or 3 years ago, they started down this path of being commentators in the cultural wars. And that's it's become all consuming for them. And I don't see them posting about other things. And maybe that's their war. Maybe that's the battle they need to win. I'm not criticizing that, but I'm just saying that I don't think I'm going to add value there in a positive way for the kingdom by just lurching into the fracas and start throwing mud. And so I think I'm going to go on this path still. Having said that, you never know. That's another reason why I don't try to plan overly much, is because I think the Lord has, in a gracious way, made fun of many of my plans from previous years. And so I feel I'm going to be glad with what comes from his hand regardless. But I still find it very hard to see and interact there. And I just wanted to check with you, given the acrimony and the way that things can go wrong in the culture wars, how does that affect where you want to be, what you want to be reading about, where you want to be commenting and taking part, and those kinds of issues?
Certainly, we are called as Christians to be engaged in culture. So it's not as if I want to ignore cultural issues. There are some important areas where that needs to be done. My own denomination is in the midst of a fairly deep dive into a report on human sexuality and what that means for the church and those kinds of things. And so it's somewhat my responsibility as a leader in my church, as an elder and as a council president, to be engaged in studying those things and learning a little bit about what's going on, and especially in terms of the studies that folks in our denomination have done. And there are other areas too of the culture that are important to deal with. I practice law, and so certainly that has an impact on my work. In my community, there are issues around things like race and socioeconomic class and those kinds of things that need to be dived into, and policy issues that need to be dived into. So I don't ignore those things, but I also feel that there is a way to engage in those things that considers who the audience is. So there are certain audiences I may engage more on some of those issues, and certain audiences where I may engage less on those issues, because I don't want to be a stumbling block to people. And I don't want to get so caught up in heat that we're no longer shedding any light on those things. And there is a sense in which that even beyond the issues of the day, as important as they are, and I do believe that many of them are very important, there is still the overwhelming, much broader issues that really impact us in every culture and in every time and place in the world and in the universe. And so those timeless truths also always need to be dealt with. And I think there's always got to be a little bit of a balance. You can become so engaged in the things that are important in the world today that, what are they? You get so caught up in those things that you're not really thinking about things above. And that's not. But there is also the criticism that has been made of people that they're so heavenly minded that they're no earthly good. And I do want to be cognizant of that as well. So to me, there's always a balance. And the way that I walk that balance depends a little bit on where I'm engaged. I may talk a little bit more about issues surrounding race and economic class and policy issues in areas where people have said, hey, we want to be engaged with those. And I'll do that more there. In a group like this, where it's the Center for Excellence in Theology is the name you gave it, and I think it's a great name. And that also causes me, as we engage here, as I want to do work that's excellent, and I want it to be theologically based, and I want to engage people on that level here. And oftentimes, in order to do that, we need to maybe steer away from some of these more earthly or day-to-day types of things that can cause us to lose our focus on things above. So it is a little bit of a balance. And because it's a difficult balance, I don't get too critical of people who maybe choose that balance in a different place, and I'll engage them where they're at. But it's one of those things that we've always got to be cognizant of how we're balancing those things based on who's listening and who are we engaging with, and what are the goals that we have in mind for in a particular time and place. So it's the same thing. I wouldn't preach a sermon on a political issue, on a political issue of the day, an issue like, should we build the wall along the border, or should we increase taxes? Those kinds of things. I would never preach on that, because that's not really appropriate. Might I talk about what is biblical justice? Sure. But that's a whole different thing. And in the same way, when I'm in my work at the city, I'm not necessarily going to spend all my time talking theology, because that's not going to go over really well in that role. And I will talk more about policy. Why do we make certain policy decisions and those kinds of things in that world? And I think there is room for different types of engagement in things and in that regard. Any last words from you on this topic? A good discussion, I think, and really a neat way to wrap up one year and start thinking about the next year. Any thoughts from you?
I do have one final thought, and I won't be long with it, but I just wish to share with you, as well as other folks listening, what a joy it has been for me to run things by you. So you and I have talked privately about what are we going to read in the next 6 months? What are we going to read in the next year? Where do we want to go? What do we want to focus on? And I have found that sort of just creating a little mini presentation to you and talking it out with you, and you giving me, being a sounding board, but also giving me some independent perspective, and even at times possibly some critical feedback, has been a great sort of iron sharpens iron kind of situation. And I would actually just suggest to our listening friends, if you can find a reading buddy to help be a blessing with you, help you focus on the things that are going to matter the most to you, I think it's going to be very profitable. And I'm going to be talking more about this with you, Chuck. You did ask, but thanks for just a great discussion. And may I just say Merry Christmas to you and your family.
And same to you. Merry Christmas to you and to your family, and to all those that you engage with. And I know that you work with the church down there too. And I just pray that not only this Christmas season will be a blessing to you and to your family and all your friends and acquaintances there, but that this coming year will also be a year of great blessing. I trust in God's faithfulness, and we see God's faithfulness in all things. And I pray for showers of that faithfulness on you in the coming year.